today. Great, and then go ahead and go back to sharing your
Do I need to
presentation
turn?
screen.
Oh no, that's on.
It's on.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, and hit present to everyone. And then back to here. And go ahead and
Go back into presenter view. Okay.
Yes.
Everything else is all things PLA. Always makes me worried that it's like if you're an archive lawyer, it's in the basket.
All right, I'm gonna go use the ladies' room if you guys are ready to be in here.
Next week is conference. You heard that? Good, sounds like someone that I know. Yeah. And I might get sent to these things because I'm retweeting feedback from the digital QA people around. So, well, let's look at the library. Now we're not going to have to be in reality. Or talk to someone about reading over the speech. Hi. Really to do GIS stuff. Bronze, Iron Age complex that no one's really done anything with, but could be there by all accounts. Yes, yes. Special place in our market. Yeah, it's really cool. Next to you.
Does that seem to be casting then?
Yeah, it is.
It is?
I can show
Okay.
you actually if you care.
Okay, cool, yeah.
I watched a couple of the ones that were posted online
Yeah.
before, which I thought was so cool. What time is it in Leipzig?
5. No, 6 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Decent hours.
Yeah. So. Yeah, it is. It's, there's a little bit of a lag. The sounds go and the sides of it.
It is,
So is the mic, is it just coming directly on that
It's coming from your computer, yeah, so I wouldn't, it's pretty sensitive,
Okay.
but.
I wanna
maybe
make
don't
sure that I'm
stray
not
too far, yeah.
yelling at them. We'll try that.
let me know if they're like,
Yeah, I will.
Feedback is on
For sure.
It's such a great idea to post not talks so that people can. Which I find after a while internationally, it's always all the different.
Yeah.
It is a two-page white paper. It's nice also because then people do miss them, but want to see that. I don't think that much anymore.
I watched.
I have so much that if I'm traveling somewhere, I have.
Okay, that wasn't here.
I enjoy myself.
Maybe it was a.
That's why it was.
It is
on
real
the
hard,
line.
wasn't it? Yeah.
I did get babysitting in the afternoon sometimes.
Yeah.
For the section that apparently was important.
So, who usually comes to these things? Is it
It's in the other
students or-
individual.
Usually it's just for the students. I don't know how many students we got today.
It's actually already period.
Yeah.
I guess it's the last day of classes.
But, okay.
I was wondering. Yeah.
There's some-
Yeah, I'm sorry, I think it's actually the last usual day.
Because they're
But I'm
having
not-
lunch and then
Are you
like
saying for next week?
discussions of working groups.
This week, what are exams?
I think there's something, I think they're next week because class is them today and then reading period goes through the beginning of next week.
Did we not have a reading period anymore because of?
Well, I still think there was some reading period.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm so jealous. We teach through June 15th.
Really?
We're on order system.
Oh.
Yeah. I'm in,
Well, you're at a big state
Five.
university, they expect you to teach a lot.
oh yeah. I'm in week 5.
And not that many universities, state universities actually employ.
No, that's, no, I was thinking.
All of these except for Berkeley are. Have a lot in.
I wasn't UCLA in February, that was
Yes.
yeah.
I was at UCLA for 6 years, so before I got to Santa Cruz in Northern California. And indeed, it is possibly the best weather in the world there. And February is a lovely time to visit. They have
It is a lovely time to visit.
yeah, they have a historic library in Pasadena that does all of these events for historians, mostly of sort of colonial America and things like that. And they run all of these things in January and February, and everyone from the East Coast comes over and asks.
We're all happy.
Pasadena sunshine.
I was in Los Angeles for a Budweiser and Island in February, and I dragged my husband to make, he loves coming. He's like, what, California in the winter? Oh, no, not terrible. And we wanted around Los Angeles, we drove all over from California, which was really nice.
Yeah.
So the next time we went back, I went to Southern California. Yeah, it's a big state, you grew up in Massachusetts, it's large. My rest of my family's from out west, so I'm used to larger states, but you're used to driving across New England, you know, it can be a little intimidating. Like, what do you mean the traffic would take as long as I could go across the entirety of New England?
This is true. Yeah, I used to drive up to where I'm at, Santa Cruz from LA, and it's like a 6-hour drive. And that's still not even, it's probably, half the distance of the state north. So
Let's get over with Pennsylvania.
Should we get started? What time is it?
It is 12:04. Yeah, well, my phone tells me that it's 12:04, so I'm not sure how much more reassurance I can give you as to the time. Or is that about whether we should start it
it's a
now?
sundial.
I was more wondering if anyone else would first use this plan. Okay, well, welcome everyone to one of our final installments of DCNE. We're thrilled to have Dr. Elaine Sullivan here today from University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Sullivan has a background in Egyptian art and archaeology from Johns Hopkins University and is the project director of the 3D Sakura project as well as the project coordinator, correct me if I'm wrong, of the Digital Twin Act project. With many years of field excavation experience in Egypt. And she'll be speaking today about 3D modeling and GIS for temporal visualizations of long-lived ancient sites. So thank you so much.
Great. Thanks.
So I'd like to thank Stella and Lisa who helped organize my trip, and I'd like to say hello to everyone in Leipzig. I believe it's incredibly important that scholars of the ancient world who are doing research with emerging technologies have forums like this to discuss their work, as the problems we confront in terms of source materials and methodologies really differ drastically from our colleagues working with modern data in the wider digital humanities. And it's key, I think, that we work across traditional subject boundaries to create a community of scholars with the technological experience who can evaluate and promote these new types of digital projects. So today, I'd like to discuss with you how I'm attempting to address questions of ritual landscape and the negotiation of community memory at ancient sites. And my own work focuses on the site of Saqqara, one of the most prestigious and long-lived cemetery and ritual centers from all of ancient Egypt, with burial and cult activity at the site spanning more than 3,000 years. From the period of state formation in the Egyptian Dynasty I, around 2550 BCE, and all the way into the Roman period. And I've been working to combine the powers of geographic information systems, which are GIS spatial databases, with 3D modeling in order to gain new perspectives on the site. And I hope the type of research questions under consideration and the techniques I'm utilizing in this project are interesting to the larger community studying the ancient world. So in this talk, I'm going to begin with a discussion of the major issues that I'm hoping to address in the project, and then walk everyone through the process I've been using to create temporal visualizations of the site using GIS and 3D. I hope to show how the combination of these technologies offers something new and potentially important for the study of long-lived ancient landscapes. And this is very much a work in progress, and I'm still experimenting with new technologies and techniques. Ancient landscapes, including both the natural environment and the monuments built within those environments, have been recognized by scholars as playing a major role in influencing human culture. In his 1994 volume on the phenomenology of landscape, Christopher Tilley argued that we cannot conceptualize space as a neutral container or surface within which human activity in any place would have had the same impact. Instead, Tilley argued, space must be reconceptualized as influencing human action. It is socially produced, socially interpreted, and specific places have unique significances that impact the activity taking place within. Tilley advised that, quote, the relationship between people and it is a constant dialectic. The landscape is both medium for and outcome of action and previous histories of action. This resituation of landscape as central to the human experience has resulted in their inclusion more recently in examinations of how concepts of memory functioned in ancient societies. Classicist Susan Alcock's book, Archaeologies of the Greek Past, argues that while texts are certainly an important primary source for understanding how cultural groups envisioned and re-envisioned their past, concepts of memory were, quote, embedded and supported within a material framework. Monuments and landscapes provide a scaffolding on which group memories could be fixed. Especially important, one could imagine, in low literacy societies like Egypt. The built and natural landscape in which a group lived played a major role in a community's sense of its own shared past, as well as its understanding of the present and the future. These spaces were thus the focus of the renegotiation of such communal memory over time, as shifts in power or priorities created conflict with past histories. As the Egyptologist Jan Osman, who has written widely on the sense of the Egyptian sense of the past, has commented, quote, the past is modeled, invented, reinvented, and reconstructed by the present. The study of ancient landscapes offers insights into why certain spaces gained and retained their importance, and how people continue to interact with the built spaces of their ancestors based on personal and cultural memory. Ancient peoples constructed communal memory through the reinterpretation of past monuments and landscapes. And as Norman Yaffe has argued in his book, Negotiating the Past in the Past, this involves consciously choosing or rejecting symbols of their forebears, often inscribing new meanings to these places. Just to look a little bit at the Egyptian sense of these ritual spaces and concepts of memory, I want to take us briefly to the site of Abydos. Egypt's kings of the first dynasty built their tombs at the site of Abydos in an exclusive desert cemetery reserved only for royals. The burial stood before a dramatic backdrop of a series of high desert cliffs, split by a wadi that a number of Egyptologists suggest may have been envisioned by the earliest Egyptians as the entrance gate to the netherworld. Janet Richards specifically argues that the two doors given to the royal mastaba tombs situated here opened symbolically towards both the ritual route linking the burials to the city, and secondly, towards these cliffs and thus the setting sun in the west. The early burial ground at Abydos was considered so sacred that non-royal burials were excluded here for around 800 years, covering the entire Old and Middle Kingdoms, despite the desirability of the site, as shown by the use of other areas of Abydos in the desert for burial. And Egyptologist David O'Connor, in his recent book, Abydos, Egypt's First Pharaohs and the Cult of Osiris, described a series of royal stelae from Dynasty 13 at the end of the Middle Kingdom, which had originally been placed in four corners of the royal cemetery. And these confirmed that this holy land of the cemetery should only be accessed by priests carrying out ritual actions, and that the building of new tombs in the area was expressly forbidden. In the Middle Kingdom, when the identity of the owners of the tombs in this impressive location had been forgotten, shifting memories turned the burial of one of the first kings named Jer into that of the god Osiris. Richards has argued that the site was a persistent place, maintaining its restricted sense of the sacred over an incredibly long period of time because of features of the natural environment. O'Connor has suggested the site's identification in the Middle Kingdom with the mythological place Poker, the location for the burial of the god Osiris, was expressly linked to the specific combination of the built and natural landscape at this time. The myth of the god set in his burial in an open place, and Abydos was a perfect location with both an open valley mouth and a clearly even then ancient burial. Abydos provides a fascinating example of how sacred landscapes in Egypt were renegotiated and reinterpreted to fit changing religious or political priorities over time. The site's original significance as a royal cemetery was forgotten, but its natural and built features reinforced the site's importance, and ritual activity continued despite the changed focus to the god Osiris. In later periods still, pilgrims coming to Abydos would leave offerings to the god outside the main sacred zone, and there are now literally hundreds of thousands of potsherds piled up over whole sections of the desert, attesting to the incredibly long-term continuity of conceptions of sacred landscape in this place. While dramatic natural features such as the wadi and desert described here could clearly influence interpretations of ritual spaces, monuments and the built landscape played just as major a role in the renegotiation over memory in a number of ancient societies. In Egypt, this happens at the highest royal level in a variety of documented cases. For example, at the beginning of his reign, King Amenhotep IV, who later changed his name to Akhenaten and started a religious revolution in Egypt, built a series of temples to the solar god Aten at the Temple of Amun at Karnak. The foundations of one of these structures, called the Gempa Aten Temple, has been excavated at Karnak east of the Amun Temple. And here's just a visualization of part of the excavated areas. After Akhenaten's death and the period of restoration under King Tutankhamun, the Gempa Aten and other structures were disassembled stone by stone and used as fill in the new pylons built by Horemheb at Karnak. Akhenaten's name, image, and monumental presence at Karnak was effectively disappeared inside the skin of other structures. The memory of the entire family line was intentionally wiped out by Horemheb's successors, and the entire period deleted from king lists. A second case at Karnak centers on the female king Hatshepsut, who took over the title and powers of pharaoh while initially ruling as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. And her bark shrine, which is called the Red Chapel because of its vibrant pink stone, was taken apart and replaced with a new royal shrine after her death during the reign of her stepson. Her image was also carefully removed from the temple walls. And again, we see royal negotiation over history and memory played out through ritual architecture. Alcock notes that part of understanding how cultural memory functions in society means examining forgetting. When and why monuments are destroyed, why are ritual routes or important views obscured? When do ritual spaces lose their meaning? When forgetting happens, why is this possible? How long do alternative histories persist? While change in meaning can happen organically, it can also be the result of policies enforced from above, as in the Egyptian cases mentioned here. As Alcock notes, often the suppression of memory takes place because, quote, it is no longer in anyone's interests, political, economic, personal, to remember. So past landscapes can inform us not only about ideologies of power and how social interactions were structured, but also about negotiations within communities, about memories and interpretations of the past and present. Okay, great, but how do we access those past landscapes? Perhaps some people are incredibly lucky, archaeologists or historians whose site has changed very little since ancient times. But most of us don't have the fortune of Pompeii moments, freezing our sites in time and space. The places that we visit today are the result of thousands of years of change, both architectural and environmental, that have altered our sites in ways that make accessing those early landscapes very difficult. First, we need to acknowledge that the built and natural landscape of the past were not static, even in the past. Especially at sites with occupation that extended over long periods of time, buildings and natural features were modified, destroyed, and added, altering those places and offering new potentials for meaning and memory. For example, the site of Karnak, actually clear that off. The site of Karnak, part of the ancient city of Thebes, shows how an ancient built landscape could change dramatically over time. This video offers a visualization documenting changes at 30 moments in the life of the temple, starting with its earliest hypothesized form in the Middle Kingdom around 1950 BCE through the Roman period. When visiting Karnak today, the earliest forms of the temple are in many ways invisible, destroyed or overlaid by the later constructions, which you can see here dramatically altered the form of the site over time. Reimagining the sense of space at any one of these specific moments is incredibly difficult to do. So injecting temporal questions into the study of the architectural landscape of a place, therefore, elucidates how new features are added or modified in response to the existing land or building scape. We can trace the built environment's transformation in form and meaning, registering these not as inevitable, appearing out of thin air, but the result of conscious decisions made by individuals shaping and interpreting their world. A second challenge for accessing past landscapes centers not on ancient change, but modern. Those of us working on ancient material know that years of change to both the built and natural landscape make it difficult to reimagine the interaction between ancient place and environment. Modern urban expansion and industrialization is one such change. This is a beautiful day in Cairo. So Saqqara and its neighboring sites like Giza, shown here, have the misfortune of being at the outskirts of the modern city of Cairo, which sprawls up to the very base of the desert plateau. Vehicle emissions and thick smoke from factories clog the air, making ancient visual linkages between distant places lost due to these poor visibility of modern times. Long-term environmental change can also dramatically change landscapes. Anyone who's visited Ephesus or Ostia knows how strange it is to visit a city built on port trade that now stands nowhere near the water. Modern research has demonstrated that the Nile's course has shifted drastically since ancient times, and thus a number of Egyptian sites are also no longer linked to waterways in the manner of the past. These changes must be accounted for in any attempt to trace movement in ancient landscapes. So the examination of ancient landscapes must reckon with the fact we are reimagining a series of now disappeared environments. How can we do this? I would like to suggest today that the combination of GIS and 3D modeling offers a new way to address those issues. The GIS, 3D GIS, allows us to replace now destroyed or altered monuments in their original location in a platform containing a geospatial coordinate system. It allows us to simulate multiple temporal phases over time, to recreate terrain and waterways that have been altered due to human or environmental change, to view the resulting data in 360-degree space, and to simulate embodied movement within 3D spaces. I believe that these new capabilities, with these new capabilities, we can begin to approach ancient landscapes from the type of historically situated frameworks that we as scholars desire in order to approach complex questions about change and meaning. So let's travel now to the site of Saqqara. This ancient Egyptian cemetery served as a burial place and cult center for kings, administrators, royal family members, artists, and non-elites for over 3,000 years. Pyramids, mastaba tombs, and huge funerary enclosures still attest to the site's original grandeur. My project, 3D Saqqara, attempts to create a four-dimensional investigation of the cemetery, examining a landscape through space and time. The project integrates published data from years of international excavations at the site with satellite data and recently published geomorphological studies. By simulating the changes in the built and natural landscape of the site over time, 3D Saqqara attempts to digitally recreate the main visual elements of the site in order to explore the nexus between landscape, memory, and community identity. So specific questions I hope to broach through this study include, are monuments resurrected in importance and use at later times? How does visibility in the landscape affect these resurrections? How does memory or interpretation of the meaning of a place change over time? In what cases are tombs removed, covered over, obscured, and why? Can we trace patterns of how monuments are constructed in response to changes in the built or natural landscape? Collective activities like festivals and processions at the site would have played a major role in creating or enforcing ideas of communal memory. How would movement during these activities affect visual linkages? And who is remembering and how? Can we see examples of what scholars term different memory communities? So how can 3D visualizations help us approach these issues? Traditional research methods do not allow for the testing of such questions. But by using GIS and 3D modeling, we can digitally recreate multiple phases of the cemetery. Just as important, these 3D environments allow modern viewers to experience the now lost landscape, seeing what an ancient person potentially saw, virtually moving through and around a place, providing a perspective unattainable through 2D media. The first major advantage of 3D modeling is our ability to remove later construction at the site. Due to the patchwork nature of the development at Saqqara, which was constantly in use from the early dynastic period through the Roman period, lines of sight and the appearance of any given chronological moment have been obscured by later but still ancient constructions at the cemetery. So one has to peel away these later layers of construction. Second, the landscape at Saqqara has been altered dramatically by thousands of years of sand blowing in from the western deserts, covering and obscuring monuments. And so in order to replicate any moment in the ancient past, ground level of the time must be reconstructed to the best of our ability. Third, the superstructures of many of the monuments at Saqqara, as well as the town of Memphis, have collapsed or suffered purposeful destruction. These superstructures, some of them originally many meters in height, need to be digitally reconstructed in order to represent their visual impact at any given time in the past. And of course, the shifting position of the Nile River must be accounted for. So while 3D Saqqara is definitely still a work in progress, I'd like to show today a few key points in the process of constructing the model. And we are using Esri's ArcGIS program, shown here, as well as the new City Engine 3D platform, which is built primarily for urban planning, and then the 3D modeling program, View Infinite. I should also mention that trying to understand the landscape at Saqqara is not possible without contextualizing it within its larger regional framework. And Saqqara was one of just a number of royal and elite cemeteries on the high desert above the political capital city of Memphis, located in the floodplain. And I'm particularly interested in thinking about visual landscapes, and thus I've expanded the project out to include information on the major sites that were part of this larger region of Memphis. So the first step in my process is the gathering of spatial data from excavations and combining it into one digital platform at a single scale combined with modern satellite imagery. And this is actually quite a challenge, as in many cases, early maps, which have problems in terms of accuracy or resolution, are the only existing record of excavations in an area. So this map you can see is from 1856. Published excavation maps come at incredibly varying scales and extremely different resolutions. So one has to constantly reconcile this data and try to get the best possible accuracy. So here, for example, I have a topographic map of the site of Helwan at low resolution from the 1970s in black and white, with the color excavation map in much higher resolution and detail, but with much smaller coverage from the 1950s and 60s. So here's another view of that 50s and 60s map with more modern maps from recent excavations in black and white on top of those. So an additional challenge is that sometimes the multiple levels of information do not actually match seamlessly. The goal is to combine all these pieces of data at many different sizes and resolutions and to digitize each element into the GIS. So here you can see the red topographic lines traced by hand from the map, as well as the pink rectangles representing the footprints of the mastaba tombs at this site. And eventually all the data is combined and integrated into a single platform. And this is key because it allows us to use data at so many different scales and from many different publications and to combine it all really into one single place. Here you can see the area that I just showed is in the blue box on the far right-hand side of the screen. And it's only a very small area of a much larger zone of Memphis being mapped. On the left, in the purple box, is the area of central Saqqara. And I would never be able to find a map at the resolution I need to cover all of this area. So the digital aspects of GIS allow me to zoom in when I need it, but also to zoom out for the kind of larger coverage, like this view of 7 topographic maps geo-referenced on the satellite imagery and placed together. So here's a close-up of the central and north Saqqara zone, that purple zone. And the polygon footprints of the site are here digitized in pink. The result is that all of the data is visible and accessible in the same GIS platform, with all the data geolocated in the same spatial system and visible on modern satellite imagery. Another major element of this type of reconstruction is creating terrain, which represents to the best of our ability the landscape of that time. The topographic line maps I showed can be digitized with each line assigned a value for its height above sea level. Here in green, you can see the whole Memphite area digitized in low resolution, while the area of Saqqara, which is my major focus, done in red, and then Dashur in purple. And these lines are done in higher resolution, so the area shows as much denser. A close-up of these specific areas shows that we can use these lines to create height maps, or elevation models, that recreate the topography based on the topographic lines. Here's the resulting photographic terrain created from those topographic lines. And most exciting is you can add in elements that reflect specific moments in time. Like here I have the projected position for the Nile in the early dynastic period based on the research of a group of British scientists doing drill cores and studying satellite imagery. So we now have a digital model of the terrain and polygon footprints that I can turn on to show me where the monuments are located within this height map. The terrains can also be adjusted to try to better reflect ancient ground level based on knowledge gained through excavations. So this view of the GIS shows the area of modern Mitrahina with the major temple outlines in pink, and that's basically the temple zone of ancient Memphis. The red dots mark places where excavations have identified dated floor or ground levels in and outside of structures. So these floor levels and ground elevations can be incorporated into the GIS with the modern topographic lines adjusted lower to reflect the height in ancient times, because the floodplain is meters higher than it was in ancient times. I'd like to take a moment to mention here the fact that a great deal of the primary and GIS data used for this project was shared with me by other Egyptologists. 500 monument footprints at Saqqara in shapefile format, which are shown here in red, were shared with me by Dr. Emanuele Brienza of the University of Cuore, Sicily. And the topographic line data for Giza and a number of sections of the larger Nile Valley, here in blue and green, were given to the project by the Ancient Egypt Research Associates. And a number of the original maps on which the topographic line data was digitized for Saqqara were shared by Dr. Ana Tavares. And because so many of us in the field of archaeology are using GIS technology, we have the opportunity to easily share data, saving us all time and money and not repeating the same process of digitization over and over again. So I'm really hoping that some of us can think about ways to standardize this kind of data. So now we're ready to move into 3D. We take published archaeological plans and architectural reconstructions and model them to scale in a simple modeling program. So this is a wireframe view on top of the ground plan. And then here's the massing model view of that same structure. And after this, we add in photographic textures to replicate the general visual aspects of these monuments, trying to match stone size, color, and pattern if known. And these are not highly detailed models, as the project is interested in understanding sort of the site in whole in a very large perspective, and not the context of specific texts or imagery. So we can model the structures quickly and relatively easily. Now, to combine our 3D models within the GIS, we move into the 3D program City Engine. And as you can see, I've assigned a number of the GIS polygons elevations. So instead of existing in a 2D world with all the polygons lying on the same plane, the base polygons have heights. Here I'm turning on the height map so you can see the three-dimensionality with those base polygons now sitting on top of the height map. We can then add our models into City Engine, placing them on the raised polygons to give them the correct elevation. And then finally, we turn the terrain back on and we have a fully integrated visualization of the 3D terrain and monuments. And so this is the reconstructed pyramid, causeway, and valley temple of the 5th dynasty king Unas at Saqqara. While the project team has created custom models of major Dynasty 1 through 6 monuments, there are a great number of monuments, mostly mastaba tombs like those shown here at both Saqqara and Helwan, that were excavated in the early 20th century. And only the most basic information is known about these buildings, primarily their general location and sometimes the length and width of their footprint. So while we can't accurately reconstruct such structures, we wanted to include them in the model, as obviously they would have been an important part of the built landscape at that site. So to address this problem, we designed 2 standardized massing models representing the general form of the tombs from dynasties 2 to 3, with slightly vaulted roofs, and 4 to 6 with a flat roof and a small offering chapel. And using procedural modeling capabilities of the City Engine program, over 400 3D models for these monuments were generated. These models are based on the size of the digital footprint, with their heights assigned based on the width and the length. And so this allows the visualization of the site to include all known tomb constructions without creating individual models of each tomb. And the project was greatly helped with this step by Marie Saldana, who's a graduate student at UCLA, who's doing really fantastic things with procedural modeling in sites of the Roman world, also using City Engine. So 3D GIS allows us to place monuments in their location, combine multiple maps and sets of data into one platform, recreate 3D terrains, add 3D models into the GIS space and locate their elevations correctly in relationship to the terrain, and then view the resulting data in 360 degrees. Because I'm in a GIS system, I can start to do some traditional GIS analysis at this point, but now in 3D aware space. And as I mentioned, I'm personally really interested in understanding how visibility influenced the creation and maintenance of ritual spaces in Egypt. While tomb and cult building location at the cemeteries surrounding the capital of Memphis is traditionally explained by Egyptologists in regards to construction concerns, desire for burial next to high status individuals, state administrative organization, familial relationships, or in response to changing religious ideas, the importance of visibility at this site has only really been rarely considered seriously in descriptions of the cemetery. And this is surprising to me since constructions were monumental in size, generally intended to be conspicuous. And as I've talked about earlier today, the Egyptians were very concerned with visibility and visuality in their culture. So in order to begin to understand visual relationships between monuments at Saqqara, as well as between Saqqara and other archaeological sites in the region, I can run viewshed studies and begin to make formal analysis of spatial relationships. Anthropologist Marcos Labrera, in his article, Reconstructing Visual Landscapes, has described how intervisibility and co-visibility were means of creating larger networks of meaning, meanings that transcended one specific place. Indeed, it is possible that intervisibility between Saqqara and the surrounding royal and elite burial sites in the larger Memphite area was a major factor influencing a sense of sacred landscape. Thus, a study of sacred space at Saqqara must also include the basic visible constructions of the surrounding sites, including Abu Ruwash, Giza, Abu Sir, Abu Ghraib, Dashur, Heliopolis, and Helwan. Within the City Engine viewer, the researcher can now fully interact with the created landscapes in 360-degree space. So to set specific locations for viewing or movement, points and lines created in ArcMap can be imported into the viewer. These can be given exact elevation heights or snapped to the surface terrain. And I brought in an outline of a human figure here to show scale. He's about 1.6 meters tall. Virtually standing in this re-envisioned landscape, sightlines and panoramas of interest can be tested in the viewer in a way that more closely mimics human sight. And this is my figure, Hezira, is standing here in the 5th Dynasty site of Abu Sir, and he's looking back towards the site of Saqqara, and you can see the step pyramid sort of in the center of the screen. Now, while City Engine offers solely qualitative visibility opportunities, viewing one's data in the 3D ArcScene environment provides additional quantitative possibilities, as the program is capable of performing 3D analytics. In order to move the 3D monuments out from City Engine, all the monuments must be exported and then imported into ArcScene. The height map terrains created for City Engine cannot be utilized in ArcScene, so new terrains must be created in ArcMap from the original topographic data. For display in ArcScene, a triangulated irregular network, or TIN, can be created and imported. Now, to run line of sight analysis in ArcScene, the project created separate feature classes for observer points, the point from which views will originate, here which is marked sort of with a black eye, and then the target feature, the feature being viewed. The individual points created in the observer feature class were adjusted to 1.5 meters above the terrain in order to replicate human eye level. In order to capitalize on the 3D abilities of ArcScene, target features were designed as polygons instead of points, created by selecting vertices of the 3D models. And this technique allows the researcher to investigate the visibility of the entire face of a 3D monument, a whole area or a designated point, usually, or a specific volume of interest. So not just the highest point of the monument. And this is key because traditional visibility studies measure the visibility of a designated point, usually the highest point of the structure above the terrain. But this, of course, doesn't replicate human vision in any way. Monuments are 3D objects and can have varying levels of visibility based on their varying shapes. So note here that I'm examining visibility between the 5th Dynasty pyramid of Userkaf at Saqqara in the foreground, with his small solar monument at Abu Ghorob just a little ways away. These monuments, which would have had a clear visual link during the king's reign, were later blocked by the construction of the pyramid of Nefer-ir-Ka-Ra. Note that it is not the height of the later pyramid that blocks the view, but in fact the lower side, and that is clear because the volume of the pyramids can be included in this type of analysis. Oh, and so here I'm pointing out the pyramid blocking our view and the monument behind it. So the ability to map out these types of temporal issues in 3D sparks new types of questions for me in trying to understand meaning at these sites. Did Userkaf build his solar temple and obelisk in view of his pyramid temple on purpose? In blocking that view, was Nefer-ir-Ka-Ra trying to gain his own access to important views? If so, were those of Saqqara, Giza, or another site? But even more exciting is that I can go beyond traditional viewshed questions and approach issues entirely left out of traditional GIS studies, both in City Engine and by moving the project out of GIS into photorealistic modeling programs. We can begin to ask new types of questions. How did moving through the space change the visual impact of specific monuments? For example, walking along the processional path from the floodplain west to the Serapeum, the burial place for the Apis bulls far back into the desert. Can we reimagine how the social landscape appeared to human viewers from individual places in an area, taking into account aspects of human vision like perspective? Are there changing levels of visibility due to things like a monument's color or reflectiveness? How does the visibility of monuments change over time as new constructions obscured older ones, blocked existing views, and created new links? And can we begin to capture multi-dimensional elements of human perception, movements, memories, landscapes, and the visual vocabulary that create a sense of sacred space? The color visualizations the project is producing demonstrate how such questions can begin to be approached. Individual monuments like Mastaba Tomb 3507, excavated by Emery in the 1950s, can be reconstructed with visual elements noted at the time of excavation, such as the yellow color of the niched facade, the red interior niches, and the clay bulls' heads lining the bench surrounding the monument. The entire line of Dynasty I mastaba tombs on the Saqqara escarpment can be visualized, here associated with an approximation of the landscape at that time as well. In this reconstruction, the location of the early dynastic Nile, just west of the escarpment itself, as well as the lake of Abu Sir to the northwest, no longer there, have been added in. Visualizations can be made moving within the necropolis to attempt to recreate the views of the surrounding sites from this spot, as well as to imagine the experience of walking around these monuments at human height. The visual importance of these structures, as well as the impact of the use of color, can be reimagined. Most interesting to me is the ability to combine the more photorealistic imagery with temporal studies. So here we've added in only the major monuments that would have been visible at the end of Dynasty III at Saqqara. So we can evaluate the visual impact of the necropolis at distinct points in time, having removed or peeled away the constructions of later periods. We can also begin to recreate elements of the built and natural landscape that are difficult to see at the site today due to degradation. So for example, from the 5th dynasty, the covered causeway of the Unas pyramid that ran down to his valley temple close to the floodplain is not preserved along much of its extent. And so the direct relationship between these buildings is not clear when walking at the site today, but it can be replaced in this landscape within the model. And in as many buildings as possible, we've added in colored textures so the viewer can imagine the different effects of red granite, like the columns in the open court inside the Unas Pyramid Temple, or white limestone, or other surface variation. By constructing a terrain for the entire Memphite area, we can also look at Saqqara in respect to its neighboring sites in the 3D world. So you can see here the 3D massing models we placed along the entire western desert edge, including the pyramid at Abu Ruwash in the very north, as well as the monuments of Giza, Zawiyat al-Iran, Abu Sir, and Abu Gharaud. Turning our view south, we have also visualized the monuments at South Saqqara, including the Dynasty 6 pyramids, the Mastabat al-Faroun, and the pyramids at Dashur. I'd now like to show a specific example of how I'm working through the problem of understanding past ritual landscapes with this model, and how these technologies may be able to address specific questions regarding the memory politics that I mentioned in the start of this talk, and the negotiation over meaning of important spaces over time. British Egyptologist David Jeffreys has suggested that Egyptian builders may have deliberately controlled the height and volume of the major royal pyramids in the Memphite region so that these monuments would have appeared, quote, roughly identical in size from the city of Memphis. Jeffreys proposed that from a theoretical location for the core of the early town on the floodplain near modern Abu Sir, an optical illusion would have operated to make the closer structures, meaning the smaller pyramids at nearby Saqqara and Abu Sir, appear similar in size to larger structures like the massive pyramids at Giza and Dashur, which were further away. Such a strategy would suggest that the visual relationships of these monuments to the early city was a major factor in the siting and size of construction. I thought that this was a really fascinating suggestion, and so I wanted to test this out within the modeled space. Now, when viewing the built landscape at the end of Dynasty 4 from Jeffreys' proposed town location in the model, however, the impact of the proximity on the prominence of the step pyramid at Saqqara versus the larger but more distant pyramids is clear. So I'm going to play this. So here we are standing at the location of that site of the early town as proposed by Jeffreys. We can see the step pyramid directly on our sort of left side of the screen. Now we're moving our view towards the two pyramids at Dashur to the south. So despite the pyramids at Giza and Dashur being sited on land higher than that of the step pyramid, the early town site's proximity to the Saqqara pyramid gives the monuments the appearance of substantially greater height. So this suggests that the Fourth Dynasty pyramid construction location and design choices were not based on situating the pyramids of Dashur and Giza to appear to scale with the step pyramid of Saqqara from the town. So these other monumental pyramids actually look very, very small in comparison. However, the scale of new royal pyramid construction at Abu Sir and South Saqqara in Dynasty 5 and 6 suggests the appearance of scale from the town on the floodplain may have been an important consideration at that time. So from Jeffreys' proposed town site, the 5th Dynasty pyramids at South Saqqara, which are coming into view right now, they're each approximately 52 meters tall, and they appear approximately the same size and maybe even slightly taller than the 205-meter pyramids in the far left, those of Dashur. King Teti I constructed his 52.5-meter tall pyramid on a spot at the far east of the Saqqara escarpment here. This is the step pyramid. So it appears similar in size, but again, even slightly taller than that of the step pyramid, which stood 60 meters tall, but was situated further back or west from the escarpment edge. Turning back to Giza, the 5th Dynasty pyramids at Abu Sir, which will be coming into view right now, they closely resemble the size of the huge Giza pyramids here from this viewpoint, despite the much greater size of Khufu and Khafre at 147 and 144 meters respectively at Giza. So as Jeffreys noted, Egyptologists debate the reasons for the dramatic decrease in size of the 5th and 6th Dynasty pyramids, suggesting causes based on decreasing resources or on the contrary, a shift in focus from sheer size to quality and decoration. The model suggests that their pyramids, although significantly smaller, were constructed just large enough that the inhabitants of the town on the floodplain would have perceived them to be as grand and even slightly taller than the neighboring monumental 4th Dynasty pyramids because of the way human vision and perspective work. The 5th Dynasty and early 6th Dynasty pharaohs had the best of both worlds. The small size of the pyramids allowed for more resources to be used on the embellishment of the overall complex, but their visual impact from the floodplain compared to that of the larger pyramids further away. These kings may have purposefully combined choice in siting and overall size of these monuments to capitalize on the optical illusion produced from the city. This case suggests that over the course of a few hundred years, the royal conceptualization of the monumental landscape changed, with an attempt to create new meaning for the landscape from the city of Memphis. The new approach to building may have been part of an active renegotiation and reinterpretation of the networks of meaning that affected the growth and form of ritual sites in the 5th and 6th Dynasty in Memphis. Landscape meanings may thus have been fluid, changing as the kings could ascribe new interpretations to spaces, something especially interesting to us as these landscapes seem so eternal. So the 3D Saqqara project is still under construction. And I showed you today my models of Dynasty 1 through 6. And any of you who have studied Egyptian chronology at any point know that I still have quite a few dynasties to go. But while I think I have had some success in thinking about how GIS and 3D can be used together to approach questions of landscape from new perspectives, many challenges still remain. So first is, how do I publish my results? Obviously, a 3D visual argument that involves color, movement, and ideas of human embodiment cannot be represented best in a black and white 2D book. But as a scholar, the only way I can get academic credit for my work, as well as have my work integrated into the larger general scholarship, is for it to be peer-reviewed. How can this type of material be incorporated into publications or into our larger fields effectively? Can this be done so that 3D materials are not just side illustrations to an argument, but are fully integrated in many cases, but are fully integrated and in many cases used to create the argument itself? Where will peer reviewers for this type of work come from? A second important question for sharing and evaluating 3D materials involves metadata and paradata. A landscape visualization is incredibly complex, with hundreds, if not thousands, of choices going into the project, including each topographic line, the elevation of each 3D building, the position of the Nile at any moment, color and textures, level of certainty of monument location based on varying quality of original maps, and many, many more. I could go on. All of this information needs to be available to the user for peer review. But most 3D platforms which are designed for gaming don't have the capabilities for embedding and then displaying that information to the user. I should mention that I just saw a presentation last week at the Society for American Archaeologists by Heather Richards Rossetto of the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And she's been collaborating with the German Archaeological Institute on creating a 3D GIS platform for Mayan archaeology. And they're coming up with really interesting ways of allowing the model creator to annotate each element of the model in the 3D world. And so I'm very excited by this kind of work that's going on right now. I'd also like to briefly discuss one of the preconceptions that persist about historical reconstruction models, that these models are trying to, quote, recreate the past. Such a task is impossible. I conceive of each model as falling into the realm of what Maurizio Forte called a potential past, a model of the potential state of some elements of the landscape at any given moment. Just like all models and maps, these leave out a huge amount of information, and that's done on purpose. A research model should only include the information necessary to investigate your research question. Creating a full virtual reality model with elements like people, vegetation, dirt is not necessary for many modeled environments. So returning to the beginning of my talk and the issue of understanding past people's memories and how those memories continue to influence social worlds, I'd like to highlight a quote from Alcock, who describes the tendency of modern scholars to ignore concepts of memory for ancient people because of the difficulty of approaching such questions. In many cases, she argues, we ignore the idea itself of ancient people having pasts. We, quote, relieve dead populations of the burden of their past, proceeding to analyze and assess their activities is as if they had no memories at all, end quote. Indeed, scholars have tended to look at ancient landscapes, especially of those of ancient Egypt, as eternal or monolithic or timeless. While we might admit that things have changed between now and then, across thousands of years, it is harder to admit that within ancient times, the landscapes, as well as the perception of those landscapes, changed as well. And I hope that today I have shown how new tools, allowing for the temporal and detailed visualization of past spaces, including elements of human visual perception, can allow us to complicate those landscapes and begin to approach meaningful questions about the negotiation and reimagining of built and natural spaces in the past. Thank you. And so I'm happy to answer questions or talk with people more about the project. Yeah.
Do you use any of the models you create in teaching?
I do. I love using 3D models in teaching. So I'm currently teaching a class on the New Kingdom and the city of Thebes. And I did a whole week on Karnak Temple. And so I flew the Karnak model in class, and my students learned about temple space, access, ground plans from the Karnak model. I also have a lot of more imagery in that model. It's much more of an interior space. So for that, images from the prescription of Hatshepsut where her name or figure were deleted out, those kinds of things are included in that model. So it's really helpful for students to get a sense of where are these spaces where these kinds of memory politics are playing out within the temple. Sometimes they're not in zones that would have been very visible. And so the fact that those places are still incredibly important in order to sort of remove the memory of these people says something about the ideology of both the temple and this kind of memory politics. So I love using 3D models, and I feel like my students also really appreciate them, and it helps them get a sense of scale, perspective, all of these kinds of things that a 2D shot really doesn't quite express. Yeah.
So just taking that exact question and turning it slightly, how can you use this in public presentation? Because you go to a site like Saqqara, when you've never been there before,
Yeah.
and you walk through it and you're just like, what the hell is going on? Because it's just a pile of stuff
Yeah.
everywhere, and there's these completely new period, some are excavated, some aren't. So it's so hard to understand it.
Yeah.
And how can we use these types of approaches to better understand complex sites like Saqqara?
Right. So I can imagine, like, my sort of ideal world would be that this could then be on an iPad, and you could literally be walking around a site, looking at the phasing, identifying the building that you're looking at, clicking on the building, finding out the information, comparing your view to what is left today. That's also a great way of thinking about how much has been reconstructed. There are so many complications involved in things like that. In Egypt, for example, there's no Wi-Fi at Saqqara. So, people would have to do this using their mobile technology, using cellular. But I can certainly imagine that at sites outside of Egypt, places in the US, for example, this kind of mobile 3D models would be much more accessible, probably at historic sites. I do also think that in places like in museums at the site, like this kind of type of model would also be great at the Imhotep Museum at Saqqara. So even if you couldn't access this material while you were walking around the site, it would be great if people could look at it during or after or before their visit to the site to give them a better perspective on sort of the incredible phasing of this material, because indeed it is incredibly difficult to walk around that site and even have any sense of what is from what time period and how these things all relate. And I think that's the same at sites all over the world that have this incredible amount of temporal phasing. Yeah.
Well, sort of on those ideas as well, I'm wondering, I know you talked about the importance of recognizing that you're visualizing potential past. Do you ever find that challenging in working with students on explaining the amount of pieces of information that go into creating that visualization, as well as the level of certainty that's behind it?
Yes, I mean, I think that's one of the sort of top 3 major challenges is how to express the hundreds of decisions that go into every element. And there are ways that the different modeling programs have used to try to show levels of certainty, like using things like transparency, having buildings be partially transparent. The procedural models that I showed that are very much massing models created based on the length and width of the footprint. Those I've kept just completely undecorated. They're just white buildings. So I've been trying to sort of use level of detail on structures to give a sense of how much we know about them. But it certainly is a challenge, and I don't want the visualization, because my research questions are about these sort of potential visible meanings, I don't want the visualization to become overwhelmed with different colors and transparency and things that sort of takes over the screen. So really, the ideal thing would be to have this access to some sort of interactive way of clicking on monuments and getting the information on each individual piece when you want it, so that you can really sort of drill down into that information. And that's very hard to explain to students. The Karnak model, for example, we have a website, and each model that we built has its own feature page with pictures of the site today, as well as a history of the architectural past of the monument, and where we get all of the information on the publication, and sometimes links out to those articles. So that's one means of doing that. But of course, none of that information is immediately apparent when you're moving through a modeled space. And I don't know that I go back and forth on how much information I want people to be hit with as they're moving through the model, because sometimes then it becomes more about the text as opposed to the visualized space, and that's not the point either. So I think there's a tough balance to try to come up with. Yeah.
A couple of issues. Great presentation. Thank you very much. First is the question that so somebody forward at the end, how is it going to be published and how it can be. It's indeed really difficult to if you go a model like that on even a specialist, he'll wander away, or she will wander away following their own interests. So it's kind of it seems that the traditional linear publications are still unavoidable, because this is how you build the argument.
Yeah.
And it's just I'm commenting on that because I'm struggling with a similar issue in my own research. So it's kind of looking forward to nice of you voice that. And this sort of more of a question is, you're talking about memory, which is a very difficult thing to grasp even with living subjects. Not to mention people who lived so many centuries ago. Do these models, what you work in, do they allow you to reveal some other patterns that are maybe more sort of pragmatic, which would show you that this line of temples corresponds to a particular way resources are distributed, or some kind of I don't know, transportation, something like more pragmatic that affects the decisions of why this is built here and that way.
Right.
Rather than such very fascinating but extremely difficult to grasp
right.
subjects as memory.
Right. So to address your first comment, I'm actually working with a colleague at UCLA who's been designing a 3D navigation program that allows you as a content creator of 3D models to create narratives, annotated narratives within the 3D space. And so I do agree that this sort of idea of linear leading people through arguments is indeed important. And so this is one of these sort of techniques we're experimenting with in terms of thinking what might we do that. This program, it's called VSIM. And what I would do as a scholar would create a narrative through the space. I would annotate it, I would cite my information, I would send it to you, you would download my model, then you could fly my narrative or walk through my narrative, but you could also go rogue at any point and go investigate things and say, well, the way that you set this up isn't really right. You could then create your own narrative in response to mine, or you could cite my narrative because there's actual sort of like a PowerPoint in 3D. There's places that you can go to and contest and have an argument with me about these spaces. And so I feel like these are the kinds of things we're going to need to come up with, new tools that actually make these types of linear arguments like you would make in a scholarly article possible within 3D. So that's something that we're experimenting with now, and I'm hoping when I'm finished with the Saqqara model, I'll be moving it into this program VSIM so that I can do just that, is really take people with me to go and do these views. In terms of other kinds of information, so I know that the terrain of Saqqara has been thought very much about in terms of transportation of materials up from the valley. How did the step pyramid get built? How did Unis's pyramid get built? And there are these natural wadis that look like they have been used as transit routes to get from the floodplain up, because this is it's a sharp escarpment. There's trying to drag stones up there would be sort of a terrible idea. So they're really going, seems like they've been going around. Now, one of the things I could do with the terrain model that I've made is run some least cost paths analysis and really sort of map out, okay, well, what would be the actual easiest path to go here? Are there some paths that we might not have been thinking about? Another thing that is sort of more straightforward is I'm running some just more traditional viewshed analyses using the elevation model. People have talked about visibility to the city of Heliopolis, for example, from Saqqara or from Abu Sir. Where was the last point from that city that you could have seen the necropoli on the western desert edges? And so I've been running just traditional viewshed studies that are very much visible, not visible types of things that are much less about memory and about, are these places in direct contact with each other? So there are sort of more, I would say, maybe empirical things that one could do with this. So I feel like there's probably, what I'd really love to have happen is, I use the model for what I'm interested in, and then other people use the model for what they're interested in, because there are very different things one could do with it. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I think I stopped it. Or do I have to get it so far?